All right, welcome to our Monday show. We often call it the Scramble. We've been scrambling around to tell you a story today it's actually one of those stories that's so complicated it was almost designed not to be told. Like if you make something complicated enough, no one will ever tell the story, which would probably be what a lot of people connected to this story would prefer. But we're going to do our best anyway. Let me tell you who's with us today. Steve Collins is in studio with me. Until recently, he was a reporter for the Bristol Press, where he covered government and politics. He continues to serve as president of Youth Journalism International. He kind of resigned publicly from the Bristol Press over a matter of principle. We'll be telling you about that, what that principle was. Also with us here in the first segment, Jay Rosen teaches journalism at NYU and writes the blog Press Think. A little later on, we'll talk to Michael Green. He is an associate professor of history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He's a specialist in the history of Nevada and the history of Las Vegas. So, because Las Vegas is a big part of this story. What story? All right, I am going to try to tell you this story in about 2 minutes and 10 seconds or something. And it's, we'll see how I do anyway. Okay. I have to get myself into a state of kind of Zen stillness. All right. So earlier this month, the Las Vegas Review-Journal, which is the biggest newspaper in Nevada, was sold for the second time this year. What made this one different was that the buyer was anonymous. In other words, it was not possible to know who was buying the paper. It was done by an LLC based in Delaware. Come for the shadowy corporate entities, stay for the azaleas. And so nobody knew. The only name associated with the sale was a guy named Michael Schroeder. Michael Schroeder was listed as the manager on the filing papers in Delaware, and he was the name and face of the new owners as far as anybody at the Las Vegas Review-Journal could tell. So that's a little odd. And so the newspaper, which started kind of doing its own journalistic investigation of who owned it. And over the course of a week, it basically came out that the new owner or owners were Sheldon Adelson and his family. Sheldon Adelson is, by Forbes 400's reckoning, the 15th wealthiest man in America. He's got a net worth of about $25 billion. He's a major donor to the Republican Party and to Republican causes. He's also kind of a big player over in Israel, where he's funded a free daily newspaper. So far, so complicated, but it got a lot more complicated. Now, a couple of other things were going on. One of them was that around the time the sale was probably being negotiated, this story emerged that needed to be covered or was being assigned to reporters at the Las Vegas Review-Journal, but it didn't seem to originate in the newsroom. They wanted a story about 3 judges. They wanted reporters to essentially follow 3 judges around or check and make sure whether they got to work on time and what they did and how they did their jobs. But this story didn't come from the traditional editors of the paper. Anyway, 3 reporters were assigned to 3 judges. One of them was Elizabeth Gonzalez. We'll get to her in a second. This is going to take more than 2 minutes and 10 seconds. So one of them was Elizabeth Gonzalez. We'll get to her in a couple of seconds. But basically, they wrote about 15,000 words that were never used by the paper. However, another story did come out. That story came out not in the Las Vegas Review-Journal, but in, of all places, the New Britain Herald and the Bristol Press, which the CEO, owner, etc., editor, publisher is Michael Schroeder, that guy who was the one and only face of the new owners of the Las Vegas Review-Journal until, in fact, it was discovered that, in fact, it was Sheldon Adelson and the Adelson family. All right, I'm about to tie this whole thing together as best as I can. So what was interesting about the story was that the story that appeared in the New Britain Herald and Bristol Press did involve one of the judges that, in fact, the Las Vegas paper had been asked to sort of fly-spec. And that judge was Elizabeth Gonzalez. Elizabeth Gonzalez is a judge sitting in a trial, a wrongful termination trial, that involves Sheldon Adelson's company, which is a multinational resort and casino company called Las Vegas Sands. The trial involves the termination of an executive in the Macau arm of Adelson's company, and he's claiming he was wrongfully terminated, and that one of the things that he was really trying to do was to get the Macau arm of Adelson's company separate or out of its associations or overlaps with Chinese organized crime gangs, which are known as triads. So how complicated is that? So somehow or other, the New Britain Herald and the Bristol Press wound up publishing this story. It was a almost 2,000 word story. That's long for newspapers. About business courts. About a quarter of it did deal with this Elizabeth Gonzalez, this Las Vegas or Nevada-based judge Like, who would care about that? Who reads the New Britain Herald and Bristol Press? And this is the last part. I think I'm at the last part. The story ran under a byline that had not been seen very much in the Bristol Press or the New Britain Herald. Edward Clarkin. Nobody seemed to know Edward Clarkin. There was no such person walking around the building. It was pretty clearly a false byline, which I'm now prepared to say without fear of refutation. Is a false byline for Michael Schroeder, the publisher and editor of the New Britain Press and the New Britain Herald and the Bristol Press, and the self-same person who had been kind of the representative of the Adelson's interests. All right, that took 4 minutes. That was a lot longer than I wanted it to. But I think I kind of covered it all. I want to say, first of all, that, so as I mentioned before, Steve Collins is here in studio with me. He resigned in protest over this. We'll get to that in just a second. But first we're going to go to Jay Rosen from NYU and from Press Think. So, Jay, as I've just revealed, this story is really confusing. It's hard to follow. It has a lot of moving parts. There are parts that I was not able to summarize in my 4-minute presentation. What are the parts that bother you the most? What are the things that trouble you?
Well, I think you did a pretty good job, Colin. The parts that trouble me the most is, first, the idea that, as Michael Schroeder said when he was introduced to the Las Vegas Review-Journal newsroom staff, that the people who work there shouldn't worry about who owns them, which is what he told them. They should just go and do their jobs and not even concern themselves with who had just purchased their paper, suggests a kind of opacity that's just not very good for journalism. So that was one thing. The placement of this article in a Connecticut newspaper that is primarily about business in Las Vegas is just completely bizarre, and we still don't know why this article appeared and what the machinations behind it were. A third thing that you didn't mention is the role of Gatehouse Media, which is the prior owner of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, sold the paper at an inflated price, estimated to be perhaps 3 times or almost 3 times what it is worth in market value. And it appears, although we don't know yet, that Gatehouse Media was sort of cooperating in this story, in this strange series of events, before it had sold the newspaper to the Adelson family. So what was Gatehouse doing? Why was it doing it? Why was it ordering up from afar investigations at its newspapers that touched on this judge and other strange things that are coming from far away and landing on the journalists in Las Vegas? So that's kind of important. And then just the whole idea that a newspaper publisher can say to colleagues in the press, I don't know anything about this, and kind of stonewall about basic questions like who is Edward Clarkin, is kind of absurd. It's hilarious in its way, but it's also very disturbing. So those are some of the elements of it that you left out.
Right, and there's been quite a bit of stonewalling about this in general. During the week or so between the time the sale was announced and the time that various journalists, including the ones at the paper in Las Vegas, figured out who the new owner was, Sheldon Adelson was asked point blank on CNN by Brian Stelter whether he was the new owner, and he said he had no personal interest in the company. By which, I mean, I suppose you could sort of parse that, and it's sort of like, what is your definition of is or personal interest or whatever. This is a shell company that does seem to involve his family members. His son-in-law was kind of the point man on it. But, I mean, so you have the unusual situation of a newspaper being bought by God knows who, and then you have the even more unusual situation of the person who really does, it turns out, for all intents and purposes, own the newspaper now, basically saying he doesn't prior to admitting that he does. So all of this is confusing. And Jay, you may have your own questions that you want to ask Steve Collins here. But Steve, I'm going to begin with one, which is, okay, so, well, actually, we should say something about Michael Schroeder and the Bristol Press and the New Britain Herald. Some years ago, is it 2009? Is that when he took over?
2009.
2009. Yes. So the Bristol, these two newspapers were, let's be fair, kind of on life support at that moment.
That's true. We were in, the previous owner said they were going to close the papers. We were fighting to find a buyer, to find some way to stay alive, and Michael Schroeder appeared and purchased them and came in promising that he was going to turn things around and, make us proud.
What did you know about Michael Schroeder? Like when people asked you, well, who's this new guy who just bought your papers? What did you guys know about him?
Well, we didn't know a lot. We knew he had been an editor the editor at Boston Now, which was a commuting paper in Boston that had gotten under in 2008, and that he had worked for Newsday for a long time, and he seemed to have a reasonable background in journalism. So we weren't, we hoped for the best.
To the best of your knowledge, did he buy these papers with his money, or do you not know that?
No, he didn't buy them with his money. He said that he had a friend who would purchase, who would put up the money. I mean, it wasn't his.
Do you know who owns the New Britain Press, New Britain Herald, and the Bristol Press?
No, that's one of the curious things about this. Is
you
that
really don't know the answer, and you were working there all that time.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
But we didn't worry about it because it wasn't any. There's no reason somebody would be buying it for political influence in New Britain.
Yeah.
So
it's owned by something called like Central Communications or Central Connecticut Communications.
Central Connecticut Communications.
But nobody knows what that is either. I mean, like where the money is in that.
No, not really.
That's really interesting. I had actually one part of that. That one had slipped by me. Jay, did you have any questions specifically about this whole? Okay, so this story appears in the Bristol Press, and the New Britain Herald. Its byline is Edward Clarkin, who we now know doesn't exist. Do you have questions for Steve Collins, who resigned over this? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, my first question is, when Michael Schroeder, your boss, appears as a figure in this newspaper drama in Las Vegas, what did people think in your newsroom?
Yeah, I was going to ask you a similar question, which is, did people in the newsroom know that out in Las Vegas he's the face of this new owner, at least for a week?
I really can't speak for anyone else. I don't think that maybe somebody knew he was out there, but I don't think anyone knew this was going on. I know that me personally, that when I saw his name as being out there, I thought, that can't be our Michael Schroeder. That makes no sense at all. And then I saw a picture of him on Twitter, and my jaw dropped. I couldn't believe it. But there he was.
And so you in the newsroom, or you can only speak for yourself, but working there in the newsroom and being a reporter, were people aware of any connection between Sheldon Adelson and Michael Schroeder prior to the explosion of this whole story?
No, nobody had a clue.
All right, that's very. Jay, is there anything else you want to know?
Well, what happened? Did people ask their boss, like, what's going on? Was there any sort of meeting? Was there any movement within the newsroom to get an answer, or did everyone kind of keep their heads down and go about their business?
And you're talking about when this weird story with this weird byline appeared. Yeah. What happened in the newsroom?
When Schroeder's role in Las Vegas was revealed, did the newsroom react?
Okay, I guess I have to preface this with our newsrooms are very small, so at any given time there's not very many people there. But no, I mean, there's a buzz. Everybody's sort of asking if anybody knows anything, but nobody really knew anything. And I'm not sure, mostly it was just keeping our heads down and doing our jobs. I mean, that's the way you survive in journalism.
This is true. Well, let me ask you this. Explain why you resigned. You resigned publicly. You got on Facebook and in some other sites and basically said that in good conscience you didn't feel you could work there anymore. Why is that? Well,
one of the things I do is I run this nonprofit for young journalists, Youth Journalism International, and so in that we teach students all over the world about what it means to be a journalist and about ethics. And I woke up on Christmas Eve, and that morning I just knew that I couldn't, in good conscience, continue to work for a man that I knew was just throwing everything that we stand for into the wind. And how do I teach kids how to do something and then not live up to what I'm telling them? So I got out.
We should say that a couple of things. It does take more than 4 minutes to explain this, Jay. So a couple of things that I've left out so far is that this article, this 1,900-word article that appeared under the byline of Edward Clarkin, a person who does not exist, but who appears to be Michael Schroeder. Who is Michael Schroeder? I'm pretty comfortable saying I don't think that's going to turn out to be not true. It had a couple of problems with it. One of them was that there seemed to be some pretty widespread use of material from other sources. We sometimes call that plagiarism. This was spotted by Holly Hacker of the Dallas Morning News. News, and then Matt Kaufman from The Current, I think, found 11 instances of text that was borrowed from other sources. Matt Kaufman also found that there were at least 2 people who were quoted prominently in the story, didn't remember talking to anyone named Edward Clarkin, didn't remember being interviewed by anybody from the Bristol Press or New Britain Herald, and didn't remember saying the things that they said in the story. So, Jay, that's another thing that we've kind of left out, that there were journalists would regard this story as very, very problematic.
Oh, yeah, and that uncovers another thing that's so fascinating about this drama and important to me is there's kind of an interlocking press culture that unites people working in local newspapers like Steve and in Las Vegas with people in the national press or national newspapers like the New York Times or the Dallas Morning News or bigger papers that have access to more resources. And the story, as it became known through the press, was so fascinating to journalists, but also outrageous to them, that the journalism world is now investigating these events that might have remained kind of in their own sphere without the tremendous publicity that was given to them. So now you have journalists all over the country who kind of identify with the people in Las Vegas and Connecticut and are doing what they can to bring light to the story. And in that press culture, I think it's fair to say that Steve is a hero because nobody knows what they're going to do when they're confronted with a situation like that. People have mortgages. They have kids in college. They have lives that can't be easily disrupted. But for somebody to quit like that over a matter of journalistic principle is extremely important act, and it affects everybody in journalism. Everybody in journalism kind of gets a recharge of their First Amendment batteries from an action like that. So I think we should underline that since we have Steve on the show.
Jay, and this is something we're going to talk about a little bit more in the final segment, but you're not going to be with us anymore because you have to go. So I'm going to ask you now. So, Steve said an interesting thing, which is this is how you survive in journalism these days. I mean, you put your head down, you do your job as best you can. And I think one of the tripwires that has been kicked by this and that's occasioned the kind of, almost sort of crowdsourced effort among professional journalists to try to figure this story out better is that it's part of a wave. And it's a wave of both, dispiriting things and maybe even mildly encouraging things. And this is part of what Ken Doctor, who I think is the person who crunched the numbers and figured out that maybe 3 times the worth of the Las Vegas Review-Journal is what was actually paid for it. But he calls it the de-chaining of American newspapers. So they're looking for new ownership models. Suddenly you've got Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post, Jeff Bezos of Amazon. You've got John Henry, the owner of the Boston Red Sox, buying the Boston Globe. You've got the Glenn Taylor, the owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves, buying the Star Tribune. You've got Alice Rogoff buying the Anchorage Daily Press, I think it's called. So you've got these new owners, and sometimes there are these kind of billionaires who can do this, sometimes for business reasons, sometimes for altruistic or civic reasons, sometimes some kind of fusion of the two. But it does also seem, with Adelson, obviously, as though he may have his own very specific reasons for wanting to own the biggest newspaper in the state where he does business. But there's also that kind of sense, right, that there's a new wave of ownership coming in, and we have to figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah, that's true. The old family companies are mostly given up now. The chains that had run a lot of newspapers around the country are in a weakened condition. The hedge funds have come in and bought a lot of these distressed properties, and they're doing what hedge funds do, which is generally take costs out and wait for a moment to sell high after they bought low. And then you have this fourth category, which is billionaires and millionaires, some of whom can be good for newspapers because they can absorb losses, they can provide runway or investment the way Jeff Bezos is doing for the Washington Post. But some may have nefarious purposes in mind. Now, there's nothing inherently bad about a rich person buying a newspaper. That's gone on for a long time. What you look for is, does this new owner understand the importance of the independence of the newsroom from his or her own wealth and power? And on that score, the Adelson family has done almost everything wrong that you can do, and created absolutely no confidence in their ownership whatsoever. And when you tell people, just do your work and don't worry about who owns you, that's the kind of thing that's almost an invitation to journalists to do their jobs. And that's why everybody in the press is watching this story around the country.
All right, we're going to grab a break. We'll come back. We'll have a little bit more of Jay. Mike Green from Las Vegas is going to join us as well. Steve Collins is with me the whole way here today. We'd love to get your questions and comments, especially in the final segment. The number is 860-275-7266. I'll give that out a few more times today. You may also tweet at us, at WNPR Colin.
Funny Wall Street never has complained. But publishers have worries, for publishers must go to working folks for readers and to big shots for their dough. Now publishers are such interesting people. It could be prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache.
All right, so we're back. We're trying to tell you this very complicated story, that some of which takes place in New Britain and Bristol, Connecticut, some of which takes place in Nevada. Some of it, believe it or not, takes place in Macau. We probably won't get too much into that, but in fact, this trial involving wrongful termination or a complaint of wrongful termination against Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas Sands is in some respects, the fulcrum for the article that appeared in New Britain. So think about this. Some allegations about what was happening in Macau wound up being the cause of it, or at least being the subject of at least 1/4 of this massive article that sort of popped up in New Britain and Bristol in their rather small daily papers. And once again, just to sort of set this up a little bit, Steve Collins is here in studio with me, and who has resigned from the Bristol Press in protest. Are you 100% confident that Edward Clarkin, the guy who wrote this story, highly critical of the judge in Sheldon Adelson's case, that this byline is in fact that of the publisher, Michael Schroeder?
Well, I'm not 100% positive that he wrote it, but he definitely is the one who put it in the paper.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we wouldn't know who exactly wrote it.
No.
But if Edward Clarkin is anybody, he's Michael Schroeder. I should say I have a little bit of confirmation from within the paper right now that Michael Schroeder and from a source within the paper that Michael Schroeder and Edward Clarkin are indeed one and the same. Anyway, we'll be coming back to this. Steve is going to be with me in the final segment. That's where we'll be taking some of your calls and questions too. I want to go out to the Las Vegas part of this too. Before we go to Mike Green, Jay Rosen, I know one of the things that intrigues you is that sort of in the face of the onslaught that you described in the preceding segment, this kind of onslaught of interest from reporters at newspapers all over the country. One of the responses to this from the new ownership out in Las Vegas is to hire a spin doctor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this part really cracks me up. The Adelson force has hired this guy Mark Fabiani, who's a lawyer and a fixer and a specialist in what is called crisis communications. He's worked for Clinton, Lance Armstrong, San Diego Chargers, I believe. He's an operator, and I think the reason they hired him is because reporters in Washington and New York, may know this guy, and he's sort of on terms with them where he can talk to them. So in yesterday's or today's paper in the New York Times, today's story in the New York Times about this whole story that you summarized for us, there's a section where they ask him about the Nevada judge and sort of were the Adelson family interests involved in this investigation, and Fabiani, the fixer, doesn't return their calls. And I just found that so funny. The guy is probably making hundreds of thousands of dollars from Adelson for this job. And his solution is to just stiff the reporters, And to me, it's so hilarious because I could do that. Like, I'm pretty good at not returning phone calls.
Right.
So I could be a crisis management expert, It's just like there's so many elements like that where it's impossible to figure out what they're trying to do. Whatever it is, it's not working. But on the other hand, it doesn't really matter because if you've got billions of dollars, you don't really care. But if you don't care, then why are you hiring Mark Fabiani in the first place? And it just keeps going round and round like a circus. And if it weren't for the fact that people's livelihoods are involved and free press principles are involved, this thing would be a hilarious farce.
Right. I'm still capable of finding some humor in it. Jay Rosen, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go over to Michael Green now. Michael Green, as I said before, is a professor at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he specializes in the history of Nevada and Las Vegas. Welcome to our conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So maybe we could just say a little bit about the profile of Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas and Nevada. This is not a guy who's really he doesn't give a lot of interviews, but he's a pretty public figure, right?
Oh, he's very much a public figure. He owns a major resort casino corporation. He's been very active with the Jewish community. He's given a lot of money. There's a school named for him that he and other members of the Jewish community have helped build. He also originally came here owning a computer convention, and from there bought the convention center at the Sands Hotel, then bought the Sands Hotel, tore it down, built the Venetian and the Palazzo. And he's been influential in terms of building luxury properties and promoting the convention business. He's a significant historical figure around here, and depending on your point of view, wildly popular or widely reviled.
And when the news of the new purchase, the most recent purchase of the Las Vegas Review-Journal broke, and that was sort of on or about December 10th, and it took about a week to kind of pin down the fact that it really was the Adelsons. Did people sort of know anyway? Was it sort of an open secret? Were people saying around Las Vegas, well, got to be the Adelsons?
Pretty much that. At the Review-Journal, one of the people who's been there forever turned to another reporter and said, Sheldon.
Yeah.
And, I looked at it and thought, on a business level, it doesn't make sense. He paid well above the value, well above what the previous owner had paid. On a political level, my antenna went up because he is well known for giving a lot of money to candidates who may not have that good a chance. If you go back to 2012, he essentially endowed the Newt Gingrich campaign. And I don't think many people thought Newt Gingrich had much of a chance to be the Republican nominee, but Sheldon liked him, and he stuck with him. And he certainly has a desire for political influence and power, which doesn't make him that different from other billionaires, but he certainly has found a way to exert some influence.
Right. We should say that in 2012 he told, I think it was Forbes magazine, that he was prepared to spend anywhere between $10 and $100 million on the political future of Newt Gingrich to get him to be president. And when you look at it that way, that may have been a boast because he didn't really spend $100 million, I don't think. Not on that.
And not on Gingrich, but altogether he certainly got into the middle two figures, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to elect Republicans.
No, actually, a lot of estimates are that he spent in that cycle at least $93 million on conservative candidates, and that's not counting any dark money he might have spent. But when you look at it that way, $140 million for a newspaper, maybe he just likes long shots. Newt Gingrich, newspapers. We should say that Las Vegas, he was a two-newspaper town. There was the Las Vegas Sun that was owned by the also very influential Greenspun family. The two newspapers are under what's called a JOA, a joint operating agreement now. I think the Las Vegas Sun is somehow or other delivered with the Review-Journal. Do I have that right?
Yes, it is. It's a section in the paper and has, in the last few days, done a report on the Clarkin business. And they did their own extensive research and found some information. And they have a marvelous editorial cartoonist, Mike Smith, who did a cartoon where you see Sheldon sitting there complaining about something and wanting to sue, and somebody saying, well, can you sue yourself?
All right. Well, I like that. And so, as you look at this as a historian, one of the questions I think you're going to have is how is, in fact, how malleable is the coverage that's done by the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and what does it cover that Sheldon Adelson cares about? Now, we've already talked about one thing. It'll cover politics to a certain degree. The Adelson family have even said that one of their reasons for their initial secrecy about the sale was it was heading right into the debate that was being held in Las Vegas, and they thought they didn't want it to become a separate story. That could be spin, it could be true. But the other thing is gaming, right? This is a newspaper that writes a lot about the gaming industry. industry. They're in Las Vegas. If they were in Florence, they'd write a lot about the fountain industry. So I would assume that's sort of a thing that you watch to see if it changes.
Oh, very much so. And the RJ has, in recent years, been very down the middle in terms of its gaming coverage. For a long time here, the newspapers did not cover the industry in great depth, which is understandable if you think about the fact that this was the largest advertiser. There was a need for caution. The RJ has been better about this in recent years. But they did an editorial talking about the differences between the paper's positions and the new owner's positions. And one of them has been online gaming. He is ardently against it. The Review-Journal has not felt that way. Well, that's the editorial page. Mm-hmm. And then the important question is, does the editorial page shape the news columns? And there are newspapers where there's a separation of church and state. The RJ, in recent years, has been in good shape in terms of keeping its editorial views out of its gaming coverage. I cannot say the same for its political coverage, but the gaming coverage certainly. So it will be interesting to watch this, and how does the Review-Journal now cover this, and also who will be covering it. They have a couple of people who have covered the industry for quite a while, and they are unlikely to go along with the program, so to speak.
We should say that Sheldon Adelson has sued a couple of reporters in Las Vegas in the past, including John L. Smith, who's a columnist with the Review-Journal. I think there was another reporter who's now deceased who got sued a couple of times by Adelson. And so now you have that also, Mike Green, is kind of a jumpy situation where Sheldon Adelson is now more or less the owner of a newspaper where he sued one of the columnists, not for something that appeared in the newspaper, but something that appeared in a book. But John L. Smith has claimed anyway that he was essentially forced into bankruptcy by the lawsuit.
Well, he was, and he has written an account of this, and you can find it online. He did not rehash the whole thing recently, but he has done a pair of columns, first about the purchase, then about the mysterious Mr. Clarkin, and made it quite clear that he does not take well to what's going on in terms of the Clarkin story about the judges. And in terms of Sheldon, his response was, well, here is his history. Let's see what he does. I would not be surprised if Smith is pretty sure of what he's going to do.
Right. We should say that one of the more sort of bizarre touches in the John L. Smith story. John L. Smith says that at one point his daughter was very sick with brain cancer, that it metastasized into her spine, and that Adelson offered to create a $200,000 medical and education fund for her if Smith would sign some kind of public apology and recantation of this small passage in a book he'd written about the casino industry. And he refused to do it, saying it was onerous and untrue.
Yes, and ultimately Smith did not end up losing that suit.
Right.
And that's important to remember, too. Sheldon does not have a history of winning when it comes to those kinds of lawsuits.
No, but if you can sue somebody and you have deep pockets, you can make them put them under a lot of stress while you're suing them.
No
All right,
kidding.
Mike Green, I know you have to go. Thanks so much for your time today. We're going to take a quick break. We'll come back with more of Steve Collins. We may have a little bit of time to talk to somebody from the Las Vegas Review-Journal, James Wright, as well.
Dear Mr. Newspaper Man, do you read what you write?
Today's show was produced by Edward Clarkin and Spunky South, which is the secret name of Lydia Brown and me, Kyone Wolf. Greg Hill tweets for us at WNPR Colin, and our intern is Amanda Gallagher. The part of Bill Curry was played by Wayne Newton. For show pages, articles, and the porn star names of Robin Young and Jeremy Hobson, go to our website, wnpr.org/Colin. On tomorrow's show, is the sharing economy swamping traditional capitalism? And now, back to Colin.
I think Jeremy Hobson is a porn star name. But anyway, Steve Collins is here with me right now. We're still kind of parsing this very complicated story involving the Las Vegas Daily Newspaper, the Daily Newspapers in Bristol and New Britain, a case in Macau, and lots of other complicated threads besides. So, Steve, we should say also our show on the sharing economy tomorrow kind of bleeds into where you are right now. One of the things you've done is start a GoFundMe site, which is, I assume that's to support you want to continue to be a journalist. You resigned in protest from the Bristol Press and the New Britain Herald. What do you want to do now?
Well, I'd like to remain a journalist. But I'd also like to have a job that paid a decent salary and had good benefits, and so maybe those two things are not compatible. We'll see.
You also received a $5,000 award from the I.F. Stone Foundation. This is a fairly brand new award. You're the first recipient of this whistleblower award?
Yeah, apparently. I learned about it on Christmas Day. It blew me away. Nice gift.
Yeah, and is there anything more you can say about that? I mean, did they explain to you why you're getting this prize?
Well, yeah, the son of I.F. Stone, Jeremy Stone, had seen what I wrote on Facebook about resigning and decided on the spot that he was going to create this award and give it to me because he was so he wanted to reward the idea of people fighting to keep an independent and free press.
Well, let's talk about this for a second, and we may be talking to James Wright from the Las Vegas paper in just a second. But Steve, so look, there's no real sort of rule book in the world about how journalism has to work. But instead, there are these kind of latent understandings that we all have, and they evolve over time. Sometimes they evolve in ways that we would prefer them not to evolve, but just kind of out of necessity. So when I went into the newspaper business, which was a long time before you, I mean, there was this kind of understanding that, I mean, just to go back to something that Jay Rosen and Mike Green were talking about, that the editorial page, where the editorials and opinion are written, was one thing, that it was kind of walled off from everything, ideally. Usually in the old days, editorial pages don't even interact. There's a firewall between them and the newsroom, so that the top-ranking editor in the newsroom cannot influence editorials. That's kind of fallen down a little bit. And then there were supposedly firewalls between the business side of the newspaper and the editorial content of the paper, what the newsroom does. And it's that latter firewall, if I understand you. Obviously, you don't want to work for a newspaper where the publisher, we assume it was the publisher, makes up a fake byline and puts a news story in that contains all kinds of things that violate basic tenets of journalism. But it seems to me the larger concern for you is that fundamental firewall. Can the business side of the newspaper influence content that's created by the newsroom? Can it kill a story? Can it create a story that wouldn't have otherwise existed?
Well, it's kind of both of those things. It is a strange new world that we're living in, and we don't know where it's all going, and there are a lot of alarming trends, and this sort of highlighted several of them in ways that are very disturbing. And I just felt like it was my role in this. The best thing I could do was to stand up and say, hell no, we're just not going to do this, and leave.
We should say that as we go along here, this will be your chance to ask us, call in and ask us some questions. You can tweet at us at WNPR Colin. Our number here is 860-275-7266. 860-275-7266. So Steve Collins, as you're, I think, beginning to grasp, resigned from his job at the Bristol Press because, in fact, this story appeared under what appeared to be a false byline. It involved business courts. It was not the kind of story that is typically published in the Bristol Press or the New Britain Herald, which are very small dailies that are centered on covering their immediate communities. And about a quarter of the story seemed to be kind of a takedown of a judge out in Las Vegas. Her name is Elizabeth Gonzalez. She is, as I said before, involved in a wrongful termination trial in which Sheldon Adelson has been called as a witness and is basically the object of the complaint. The two of them had clashed rather unusually in court, the judge and Sheldon Adelson as witness. So that story bleeds in a very complicated way over into the story that we've also been talking about today, and that is the sale of the Las Vegas Review-Journal to initially an entity whose principals were not identified, and then over the course of about a week this month, those owners were fleshed out a little bit more. It turns out to be the Adelson family. And Sheldon Adelson himself, the point man, the guy who was the name and face of this sale at the beginning when nobody knew any other names, was Michael Schroeder, the same guy here in New Britain who may have written that story that ran under the Edward Clarkin. I mean, I feel like I'm trying to recite the plot of a Dickens novel. It's so hard to get all this stuff. Anyway, joining us is James Wright. He's the deputy editor for local news and business news for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. If you think I'm having a hard time explaining this, imagine that you're trying to get your reporters to write this story while a sword of Damocles hangs over them. They're actually covering a story that in a way that maybe the new owners don't even want it covered. So, James Wright, first of all, welcome to the show. And second of all, maybe you can talk about that challenge. What did the Las Vegas Review-Journal staff do starting around December 10th when it realized that they had a new owner, but they didn't really know who the new owner was?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, and
Sure.
appreciate the invitation. You mentioned a Dickens novel. We think of it more like a Stephen King novel.
Okay.
It's really been pretty hectic here since December 10th. Normally this time of year is pretty slow for newspapers, but we've got just more news all the time. The announcement on the 10th took a lot of people by surprise. I think really it was a very closely held secret. And then to be told, don't worry about who the new owners are, that you don't keep a secret by telling, about 60 journalists don't look at something. Mm-hmm. It was inevitable that it would come out. I don't know why it was handled the way it was. Clearly they weren't thinking of much, frankly. It was handled about as badly as it could be. And it just put a challenge out to our staff that we needed to find these things out, and we did. And it's a tough situation. The power of the press goes to he who owns the press. We know that. And if the owner doesn't want something in the paper, then it's likely not going to make it in the paper. In this case, we're dealing with a fractured sort of situation where we've got the prior owner, Gatehouse Media, remains in place as a management company managing the newspaper. And, at a time when we're separating from them in terms of ownership, but still dealing with them in terms of production and things like that, and all of the vagaries that go with that. From day to day, we're not exactly sure who's in charge or who really is pulling the strings.
Right. So there's a couple of things that have happened. One of them is that there have been statements made by ownership saying, well, no, there is going to be a firewall. You don't have to worry. The business side's not going to meddle in the newsroom side. We'll hire a reader representative, all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, the way that I understand it, James Wright, from the very beginning, your ability to cover the sale, the purchase of the newspaper, the way you wanted to, seemed a little bit compromised, and that the original story that went up actually got changed. I think I even read somewhere that you had to replate one edition of the newspaper that was attempting to cover this.
Yeah, that's true. And what people should remember is that at any news organization, whether it's television, newspaper, or magazine, whatever, the owner has the last word on what's written about them. And that's typically been the case here as it is everywhere. The publisher would get a copy of the story, and if he wanted to tweak it in some way, then that would be done. That was done in this case in the more traditional sense, and then at the last minute, without consulting anyone in the newsroom, other major changes were made by the former owner, Gatehouse, at whose behest we don't know, through the production system, which they have the ability to do because all of our actual production is done, the page design and things like that, in Austin, Texas, at a central design hub. So changes were made there at the last minute with no one in the newsroom knowing about them. And things have happened since then, changes to stories without consulting with people in the newsroom. And in fact, we're kind of toying with the idea of having, we always will have a disclaimer on any stories that directly have to do with Sheldon Adelson. By the way, that's how it's pronounced, Adelson.
Oh, okay.
And any of his companies that we know of. But, we're kind of toying with the idea of having a disclaimer that says, this story may be edited without consultation of the author or newsroom management, because that's what's been happening.
Right. So, one of the complications, the whole thing, this Stephen King / Dickens novel is so complicated that one hates to introduce a new element to it. But really, some of those of us who are following the story, some of us are starting to swing over to looking at Gatehouse. So Gatehouse was your old corporate division, essentially. They were sort of corporate management, and there's still essentially going to be corporate management working for the new kind of Adelson-backed ownership. And that seems to be also the place that this curious assignment originated, right? This idea of fly-specking these three judges, one of whom was Elizabeth Gonzalez, seemed to come out of Gatehouse. which is, as we say, that was sort of the old management, and in a way, it's going to be the new hired management too.
Well, yeah, I've heard that. We've been told all kinds of things. I don't know what's going to stick at this point. The official version is that Gatehouse has a 2-year management contract to provide services for the paper, basically to operate for the Adelson family. At the same time, I guess you can break that deal at any time that they want, and it's notable to us in that everyone who works here except the publisher of our newspaper is actually an employee of News Plus Media, LLC, and the publisher is an employee of Gatehouse Media. So we don't know how all this is going to work, and I don't think he does or anybody really does at this point. It's sort of uncharted territory. As far as reporting on all of this, strings get pulled, but at this point we're often unaware whether it's something that Gatehouse wants to do, whether it's something that the Adelson family wants to do, or whether it's somebody within this daisy chain of ownership and managers who may be taking it upon themselves to overreact to something that they think someone wants to do.
It's first of all, I've been there for a little of this kind of thing in the past. Many of us who work in journalism have. You guys are very brave. I hope you're conveying to your reporters. Every time I read one of their stories, I think, whew, that was a scary story to write. So they've got guts and they're tough. And please, from many of us journalists here in Connecticut, say we're watching them and we're proud of them as fellow professionals.
I appreciate that. That means a lot. And we've been getting a lot of those kind of props from literally around the world, and it's been amazing to me the kind of response that we've seen, and that really helps a lot. We know we're doing the right thing for our profession. We're not. There have been a lot of things said about, maybe it's because of conservatives taking over the paper and you're all just a bunch of liberal reporters. That's really not it at all. The newspaper's already very conservative. Adelson has said that he doesn't really see much difference between his worldview and our current editorial page philosophy. The concern is the way the whole thing has been done and the kind of ham-handed way that everything has been handled in terms of editing without involvement of the staff and everything else. And then going forward, Mr. Adelson is somewhat well-known for being opposed to anything that doesn't fit his worldview. And we're wondering if that's going to be the same in the news columns, and if that's the case, then I think you'll see a lot of openings here.
All right. James Wright, thanks so much for spending some time. I sense your life is busy and hectic these days. Thanks for the time. We've only got about a minute and a half left, Steve Collins, and that's not long enough to really talk about this, but we've got a Paul from Salem calling in saying, why resign as opposed to sort of staying there, trying to figure out what the situation is and seeing if there's some way that you can function as a force for good within the New Britain Herald, the Bristol Press. They don't have that many reporters. You're an experienced reporter. Was there any part of you that thought, maybe I can make this work somehow?
Well, I've kind of been thinking that for years.
Yeah.
But, in the end, who do you appeal to when it's the guy who writes the checks, who's the one who's guilty of misconduct? I mean, there's nothing you can do. There's no one to change. He's there. He's not going anywhere. And there's nothing I could do to change that.
I was sort of wondering what he thinks. And we did ask Michael Schroeder. We asked all kinds of people to be on who haven't been on. But what is Michael Schroeder, the publisher of the Bristol Press and the New Britain Herald thing? And my guess is he thinks, he's done a good job of saving this newspaper that was going to die, that he's a community booster. Edward Clarkin initially appeared as a restaurant reviewer who writes overwhelmingly positive restaurant reviews of local restaurants. Well, that makes the restaurants happy and maybe sends a few customers their way. I mean, I would assume he thinks he's sort of one of the good guys, that he hasn't done anything terrible at all.
I suspect that that's true. He probably is reading some of these things where he's portrayed as the face of evil in American journalism, and is stunned. I can't. He needs to consider what he's doing really, and see why people say this about him.
All right, Steve Collins. Well, good luck. There's a GoFundMe site. Check out Steve Collins on Facebook as well. Learn more of the story, and we'll be following his future as well. We'll be back tomorrow with a story about the sharing economy.